Hello, thank you so much for joining me once again. Today I am going to show you some little bit older footage, mostly because I just want to show you stuff. Life has been a little crazy. I'm in a catch-22 right now where I can't do a lot of sewing because my machine needs a tune-up, and the tune-up guy is like booked 2 months out, and I can't buy a new machine because I need to sew to make money to get a new machine. And yeah, it's not my favorite situation to be in. So today I find myself editing because I literally can't sew. That being said, I did find some old footage that hopefully you will find interesting. This is footage sewing of the faux wrap dress that I do actually have for sale in my Etsy. I will leave links down below. And without further ado, here we go. The first thing I work on is the skirt, and this will have 3 darts. The 4th dart is actually built into the seam that will have the slit feature, which is part of what makes it a faux wraparound. So we're going to start off with those 3 darts and pin those and get them sewn. Next up, I am going to start sewing the long seams on the skirt. You will note that I did finish the center back seams with serging, and then I also finished the front seam that's going to be that essentially faux wrap seam, and that is because it will make the slit much easier to finish later. So first thing I do is pin the front seam, and I am only going to sew that down to where I want that top of the slit to be. And then I'm going to sew the side seams, and I'm going to sew those all the way down. These I don't bother to finish until after the seam itself is sewn, because I can finish the 2 halves together and it's more efficient that way. Once I got done sewing the side seams and that front seam, I did go ahead and actually top stitch right next to the front seam and around the slit to hold that seam allowance down and make it look nice and neat. You can also see I did fold over the center back by 1/4 of an inch and iron that down, and I did it looks like I did top stitch that one too. It's been a while since I did this project. But anyway, after that we're going to fold up the hem of the skirt and sew that down with a top stitch. Moving on to the bodice, you can see this is a very odd shaped piece, but it does come together eventually. What I've marked here is the 2 notches along the side seams, and then I've also got 4 darts marked. And the first thing I'm going to do is pin those darts to mark them, and then I'm actually going to snip at the snip just the seam allowance at both of those notches on the front and the back, and that will make more sense later. But for now we're just gonna stitch together those darts and get those ironed nice and flat. So I'm actually kind of showing here, you can see where those little slits are and why they're there, because we want to fold that inner bit over 1/4 of an inch so that we can hem that part of the sleeve and then still sew the side seams together later. So I have serged both the sleeve and the collar and folded that over by 1/4 of an inch. I like the serging because it makes it easier to fold over, but a wide zigzag works just as well. Next up, the bodice is going to start taking shape, so I do basically pin one side over the other side, and this is to mimic the wraparound style. And you want to make sure that, you know, the side that's in front is lining up with the dart that's going to be above your slit on your skirt, and that just sort of completes the illusion. I am going ahead and pinning a little bit higher up where the wrap is, just to get an idea of how that's going to fit on the doll. I do recommend sort of putting it over the doll at this point. Make sure there's no bubbles or gaps in the wraparound. This is kind of where you can compensate if your fabric has stretched a little bit while you were sewing. And it's a little bit fiddly, so just, keep working on it and you'll get there. Once I am happy with it, how it looks kind of on the doll, I do pin the side seams and then I go ahead and sew those closed. Once the side seams have been sewn, I did serge down the center back to finish that edge. And now I am going to pin the bodice to the skirt. And if you recall, we did fold over and top stitch the center back of the skirt. And now that is actually going to be a little bit relevant, because if you line the bodice up, the side seams and the darts are all going to match up, but you'll notice the center back extends farther, like the center back of the bodice extends farther than the center back of the skirt. And that is intentional. So to pin that, we actually just wrap the bodice part around that finished edge of the skirt and then pin everything else as you would expect. So matching your darts and matching your side seams. And this, to me, made a really nice finished edge that when we close up the center back later will give us the option to have a really nice flat closure. And I just thought it looked really flattering to do it this way. So it's a little bit more complicated, but I think it's worth it, especially for a fitted style dress like this. So once all of that is pinned, you just sew that as a straight line, and you can finish that edge before flipping it back right side out, and then you get a nice neat finished waist edge as well. Once I have sewn the waistband, you can see I did leave my serger threads on the long side. I am going to bury those so that they don't unravel later. And I'm using the little tool that Madeline was so sweet to send me. She has the YouTube All My Plastic Children. I'll leave a link down below. I had commented that this little tool looks so handy, and she actually sent me a sweet little card that had a few of them taped in it. It was just very kind. So awesome. It works great to get the serger thread into the needle so that you can then bury that. If you don't have the little tool, it's not the end of the world. Just use tapestry needles that have really big heads, and you can usually get all 4 of the serger threads into it. It might just take a little bit more fiddling. But once those threads are buried, I turn everything right side out again, and then I start pinning up the center back of the dress by overlapping that back finished edge so that there's a 1/2 inch of overlap. And then I top stitch that, and that makes that really nice flattering flat back seam that I was telling you about. Next up is going to be the bow, and this thinner piece I am going to fold the long edges towards the center and then fold in half again, and then I'm just going to iron that flat. You can top stitch this if you want, but it's not actually necessary if you don't want the top stitching. Then I'm going to take the little more squarish one and I'm gonna sew across, but I'm also leaving a little bit of a gap, and that is so that we can then turn it inside out, or right side out, I suppose, later. So then I am going to flatten it with the seam sort of centered, and with the right sides together I'm going to sew the short ends together. And this is essentially what's going to create the bow petals. I don't know what you would call them. Anyway, I am going to go ahead and cut as much of that seam allowance as I can get away from, because I don't really want all that bulk in the corners. And I do recommend using some kind of tool to turn this right side out. Like you can see here, I have a pair of tweezers that came with my sewing machine. And they work pretty good. Other things that work is like needle nose pliers work pretty good. Actually, it looked like my junky tweezers did not work very good. I had to switch over to a pair of nail tweezers, and I apologize, it kind of got taken out while I tried to manhandle it, but what I'm basically doing is just pushing the tweezers to the very end and then flipping it, and then I use the tweezers to go and poke in all of the little holes so that you can see it makes a nice little rectangle shape. And then I iron that flat. You can stitch that little hole in the back shut, but again, it's not really necessary because once I have the shape made, I sort of squish it down in the center in a way that looks nice, and I definitely recommend playing around with this. And then I use the middle part of the bow to just wrap around, and that's functionally it. I do sew I figure out how big that loop needs to be to look nice, and then I sew it closed where I'm pinching it, and then I just use those tweezers again to pull the bow petals through, and yeah, that ends up making a really, really pretty bow that you can then hand stitch on your product. Once I've gone ahead and completely made the bow, I did actually flip my little loop inside out, which was a tight squeeze. Yeah, you might want to make sure when you're sewing that closed you give yourself a little bit of extra room, or in fact you could just hand stitch that around the bow part, and I think that would work just fine as well. I then went ahead and just hand stitched the bow where I wanted it to be from the inside so that you wouldn't see that stitching. And then it looks like I hadn't actually sewn the center back up, so I go ahead and do that now. Once all the sewing is complete, I do go ahead and use my little crimping tool to put on the no-sew snaps that I like so much, and then the dress is complete. I thought this project turned out really, really fun, really good, and I have so far absolutely loved seeing what people have done with this pattern. Please, please, please tag me if you make stuff using my patterns, because it brightens my day every time. I just can't tell you enough how much I love seeing what people create using the stuff that I've made. It's just wonderful. That being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. I am really working hard to try and make my videos not so rambly and long and strange. My little avatar gal wasn't in this one because I'm having technical limitations in what I can and can't do, and how I want to be editing, and just how I can get things to work. So, you know, everything's a work in progress, but I hope you had a good time. I hope you enjoyed this. If you like my videos, please like and subscribe. I would really, really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.